Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Lloyd's Asia Broker Program. My name is Zai Hao. I'm from Market Development in Lloyd's Asia, and I will be your host for today. Today, we will be discussing a unique class of insurance, active Assailant insurance, and how this is a growing threat in Asia Pacific. Your presenter today will be Mr. Dominic Giacchini, Crisis Management Underwriter from Aspen Insurance. Dominic joined Aspen in 2015 and has recently moved to Singapore in the beginning of 2020 to manage Aspen's crisis management portfolio for the Asia Pacific region. His remit includes terrorism and political violence, kidnap and ransom, piracy, evacuation and repatriation, and active Assailant insurance. I'd like to remind our audiences that this session will be recorded and a link to the recording will be made available after today's session. If you have any questions at any point of time during the presentation, feel free to use the Q&A function in Webex and we will try to answer all questions at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, let me pass over to Dominic. Dominic, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Zahal, for the introduction. And good morning to everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I should say good afternoon to those of you who are in slightly different time zone across the region. But yeah, it's very good to be with you, and thank you for taking the time to hear about the risk of active assailants in the Asia Pacific region. As Zahal says, my name is Dominic Giacchini. I'm an underwriter at Aspen Insurance. We're a global insurer and reinsurer, and our main operating hub in the Asia Pacific region is here in Singapore, utilizing the Lloyd's platform. You see my contact details there on the first slide. I know we have time for Q&A at the end of the session, but if for some reason you aren't able to get your question in, or you have any additional questions on active assailants or crisis management and more generally, please do feel free to contact me and reach out with the details there. So, what is active assailant? What is the purpose of the presentation today? Quite simply, active assailant is in our opinion, the future of the terrorism insurance market. And in today's webinar, we'll be going through the details of active assailant and hoping to make sure that everybody on the call on this webinar will be able to know, what do we mean by an active assailant incident? How do these incidents affect me or my clients? And crucially, in terms of a Lloyd's and insurance perspective, what are the solutions to provide to clients? The key message I'd like to leave everybody with in terms of active assailant and the risk of active assailant incidents is that active assailant incidents are unpredictable, but they're not unforeseeable, and certainly not in the Asia Pacific region. And we'll go through a number of examples today and highlight some of the issues that the region suffered in the last predominantly 18 to 24 months. So I know we have a wide range of backgrounds and experience on the webinar today, so I thought it would be useful to begin with providing some context and some background to active assailant as an insurance product and as a risk in itself. Active assailant, as I mentioned, it has sort of spawned out of the conventional terrorism insurance market. The terrorism insurance market itself was created predominantly post September the 11th. Prior to this, 2001, prior to this, terrorism was also a listed peril within all risks property insurance. So alongside flood, fire, terrorism was a listed peril, and after September 11th, the terrorism insurance market was created. Because it was previously a property peril, traditional terrorism insurance policies focus largely on large-scale property damage and resultant business interruption. These are mainly from large-scale catastrophic events. Think September the 11th in the United States, 7/7 in the UK, London bombings, and more recently and more crucially and relevant to the Asia Pacific region, the tragic Easter bombings in Sri Lanka last year. Those incidents were perpetrated largely by sophisticated and organized terror cells. But as we're going to show you in this presentation today, whilst these incidents do still exist, the the majority and the growing trend for incidents is shifting away from those style attacks and towards lone wolf, active assailant incidents. And as I say, the insurance market has to evolve to address it and respond to those incidents. In terms of the terrorism space, some wordings were introduced to respond to some of the evolving risk from terror incidents. So there are terrorism liability policies available to the market. These again provide terrorism liability cover, and so legal liability cover in the event of a terror incident. So there has been some evolution in the terrorism market, but as we're going to see, we still feel that active assailant is a much more fit for purpose product to clients in the region. I'll leave you a couple of moments to have a look at the headlines on the screen there. Many of you will remember the tragic incidents, a number of these, what we would consider terror attacks, which were perpetrated in Western Europe and the United States over the last few years. I'm pretty sure everybody is in consensus that we see these incidents and we think these are terror attacks. We see shootings, the worst mass shooting in US history in Las Vegas. We see the Bataclan and Paris terror attacks. We see vehicle attacks across Western Europe. And the point of this is, I should say, not to scare people. It is merely to highlight the changing attack profile for assailants. So we see those incidents in Europe, and many people will remember these. But based upon what I've told you in terms of the background of terrorism insurance, do you think the incidents on the last slide would be covered by a conventional terrorism insurance policy? I believe there's a poll that's about to pop up, and so you have the chance to answer now. And I think everybody should have it on the screen there. So the options are: A, yes, of course they'd be covered by a terrorism insurance policy. They're terrorists. B, no, they're not covered. C, no, not unless they were politically, ideologically, or religiously motivated attacks. Or D, not unless they were politically, ideologically, or religiously motivated and caused damage to property. So I think we have 30 seconds. I think the poll is now ended, and I think most people's answers have come through. So we have predominantly the answers are spread across the options there, but most of you thought that D, no, not unless they were politically, ideologically, or religiously motivated and caused damage to property. Those of you that answered would be correct. The answer was D. And the reason behind that is that, as mentioned, terrorism insurance was spawned from the property insurance market. And so it has a predominantly property focus. So there must be a property damage trigger in the vast majority of terrorism insurance policies for that policy to respond. Now, what about the ideology element, the motivation element? Well, again, for a conventional terrorism insurance policy to respond, the assured must be able to prove that that incident was politically, ideologically, or religiously motivated. If a client cannot prove that motivation, the policy will not respond, and there will be no cover in place. Now, we may say, oh, that's surely very easy to prove a motivation behind an attack. But if we give the example of the Las Vegas casino shooting in 2017, Stephen Paddock, the assailant, had no prior history of radicalization, and there's no clear motive or provable motive behind the attack. Because of that, the terrorism insurance that the assured would have had in place would not respond. So, active assailant really is an evolving threat. I put the term terrorists in inverted commas there because although everybody on this webinar would describe the people acting out in those incidents and conducting those attacks would be terrorists, purely by the letter of the terrorism insurance wordings, some of them may not be. Now, these assailants no longer prioritize large-scale property damage. They've shifted their focus towards mass civilian casualties, interruption of businesses, and causing chaos, interruption to society itself. As mentioned, often there is no provable motive behind an attack. In the vast majority of these incidents, the assailant or assailants are killed by police or law enforcement during the incident itself. And it's much harder to prove a motive behind the attack of a dead person. One thing I'd like to emphasize is, whilst specific individuals or specific businesses, landmarks, types of buildings and operations, they may be targeted by assailants, it's not just the specific target themselves that suffers as a result of these active assailant incidents. We see in the vast majority of active assailant attacks that not only is a specific site impacted, but also the wider area due to police locking down the streets and maintaining security in a perimeter around an incident. Now, because of that, businesses in the local area would suffer as a result of an incident. So there is a wider impact of these attacks, not just on the specific site of where it happens. And it's also important to highlight that a threat of these attacks alone can have a significant impact on businesses. Evacuations from bomb threats are somewhat commonplace, particularly in the region, and we'll show you a couple of examples of those in recent years. So, what is an active assailant incident? What do we mean by an active assailant? Well, I'll talk about the ASPAN active assailant policy and how we define it in that, in which we describe it as purely a physical attack at a covered location involving the use of a weapon. So it's quite broad, quite broad. By active assailant, we mean a human being. A covered location is just a site. And the use of a weapon. You may ask, well, what do we mean by weapon? We mean any handheld instrument, a knife, a bat, or a gun, an explosive device, so improvised explosive devices, car bombs. Traditional, conventional terror attacks would still be covered under an active assailant policy, and that's why we see it as the future of the terrorism market, because attacks using explosive devices would still be covered. As you saw from some of the examples in Western Europe and North America, vehicles are swiftly becoming the weapon of choice for assailants. Frankly, it's a lot easier to acquire a vehicle than it is materials to create a bomb. Because of that, assailants are hiring vans, lorries, cars, etc., and prioritizing mass casualty impact. So it's quite a broad definition in terms of what we mean by an active assailant incident, and it's quite broad in terms of what we would consider a weapon. As you can see on the screen there, denial of access, as I mentioned, is a huge issue for these incidents, and that would be covered under an active assailant incident as well. But by removing the requirement for a motive, unlike terrorism insurance, policyholders, clients, and individuals can know that if there's an incident, they have peace of mind and their policy would respond. So really, by active assailant incident, we do mean essentially almost all violent incidents that would affect an area. So you may say to me, but Dom, the title of the presentation is a growing threat for Asia Pacific, and the examples I've given you so far have been Western Europe and North America. Unfortunately, active assailant incidents are a global issue, and they're not limited to Europe and North America. You'll see on the screen in front of you 5 very high-profile incidents from the last few years from the Asia Pacific region. In 2017, the Resorts World Casino, there was a shooting and an arson attack which burned down the casino and left many dead. New Zealand suffered its worst mass shooting in its country's history last year. And for Thailand suffered its worst mass shooting in history earlier this year from the KORAT shopping mall attack. And we'll be going into further details and having a breakdown of what actually happened in that attack and how does that relate to active assailant insurance later on in the presentation. But as you can see, these are high-profile incidents which also made global headlines. This is not a risk or a threat to just Western Europe or North America. This is a global issue. To provide you with a few more examples, on the screen now you'll see a graphic on the left-hand side. These are violent incidents in the city of Manila, Philippines, over the last 18 months. Every red dot on the screen in front of you is an incident that would be considered an active assailant attack. And I've broken down and given information on 4 of those incidents in particular on the right-hand side. The evacuation following a bomb threat at the financial center last year, shootings this year, a whole host of issues across Manila. And that's just to highlight the fact that despite being in having a lockdown across most places in the world due to the COVID-19 pandemic, these incidents are still happening. But it's not just Manila. If we look at Bangkok, another major city in the region, there are a whole host of violent incidents over the last 18 months, ranging from a series of bombs that were set off in August last year, which caused damage to property and injured many people across the city. 4 dead were in a shooting a matter of 2 weeks ago at a gambling establishment in Bangkok. So this is a current and present issue which affects the majority of places globally. In Australia, perhaps a country we would consider lower risk in terms of general crime rates, the number of active assailant incidents is in fact even higher than many other cities and countries in the region. Despite having somewhat strict and controlled gun regulations, a number of shootings still happen. And you can see here on the graphic, this is the city of Melbourne and the number of violent incidents that have happened over the last 18 months. Shootings, random stabbings, and IED bombs, threats, and evacuations. If we think about Tokyo, the largest city in the world, the largest city in the region, even Tokyo in Japan, which has historically had a somewhat low risk of terrorism, you'll see a number of incidents there, including an evacuation of an office of an advertising agency a matter of a couple of months ago. So this is an incident and this is an issue that happens across the world and across Asia Pacific. So as I said early on in the presentation, the aim of the presentation is not to scare you or to fearmonger. It is to point out that whilst these incidents may not make global headlines, some may not even make regional or international headlines, these incidents do happen and they do affect businesses and people across Asia Pacific. As I mentioned before, Thailand suffered its worst mass shooting in Thai history earlier this year. We're going to break that down a little bit further for you and explain the details of that terrible attack in February of this year. A disgruntled soldier, I believe he lost a card game or some sort of gambling, ended up going on a shooting spree, a rampage throughout the city of Korat in Thailand, and ultimately ended up killing many people and holding hostages at the Terminal 21 shopping mall. This is an active assailant incident, quite clearly. The assailant held hostages overnight, and after police went in and saved the hostages and killed the assailant, many people were killed, some people were able to be saved. The shopping mall ended up closing for the rest of the week until it opened on Thursday the 13th. So that's the incident, and many people on this webinar today will recognize that and remember that from earlier in the year. That's the incident, but what's the impact? Well, for the shopping mall itself, and before we start, obviously it's important to say that the loss of life is always the worst situation, the worst outcome of these incidents. From an insurance perspective, there are solutions to those, and we'll touch on those after, or responding to those after we touch on this case study. But it's difficult to look past that, and we must remember that. From an insurance solution perspective, and thinking about the financial impact of these incidents, for the Terminal 21 shopping mall itself, it's likely to have suffered smashed glass and bullet holes, either from the assailants or from the police going in to rescue the hostages. From a financial revenue perspective, You know, the Terminal 21 shopping mall was closed for 4 or 5 days during the incident and after the incident to secure the premises and whilst an investigation was ongoing. Now, even when the shopping mall reopened, it's likely they would continue to suffer a downturn in footfall, because if we all ask ourselves the question, are you more or less likely to go shopping at a shopping mall that just had an active assailant incident and hostage scenario? I think it's universally assumed that you'd probably be less likely to go to that shopping mall. And so even when the shopping mall was reopened and back up and running after the incident, they still continue to suffer a downturn in revenue financially because of that incident. So there's a medium and longer term impact of these attacks. There's also a whole host of other additional costs which are posed due to these incidents. So emergency security arrangements, temporary staff costs and retraining costs, medical expenses, as well as brand rehabilitation costs. These are all things that the owner of the shopping mall said that they would have and have incurred after the incident. There's also a growing trend for lawsuits to be launched for those who are responsible for the security of these shopping malls or premises where an active assailant incident has occurred. And although it's not clear whether that will happen in the incident at KORAT, it has in many other places. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, it's not only the specific site of an active assailant attack which suffers because of that attack. For businesses in the nearby area around the Terminal 21 shopping mall, they're likely to suffer some form of collateral damage, whether that be in terms of actual damage to their property, or whether that be due to business interruption from the Saturday and Sunday that the shopping mall was closed down because of the hostage situation. The police were on site, roads were closed, and many businesses in the local area were unable to conduct their day-to-day operations. So there is a collateral impact in terms of businesses affected by incidents. KORAT shopping mall and the KORAT attack, this is just one example, but this highlights a typical scenario in which an active assailant incident happens across a city, ultimately ending up at a specific location, but having widespread damage and widespread impact to a city and an area. So hopefully now we've provided a number of examples of active assailant incidents across Asia Pacific. We've been able to explain what we mean by an active assailant attack. And so really we come to, well, what are the insurance solutions for this? What's on the market and what is available to clients in terms of a insurance coverage perspective, in terms of a response capability and how an entity can respond to one of these incidents, and then also on the capacity available in the Lloyd's market and the global market, and particularly the Asia Pacific market for active assailant solutions. So in terms of the Aspen active assailant product, there are a whole host of heads of cover. I'll go through each of those ones individually. First and foremost, bodily injury or death benefit. So as we said before, it's difficult to look beyond the human impact of these incidents, and a form of bodily injury and death benefit is paid to those affected, those injured, and the family of those who are sadly killed. Legal liability is a huge element of coverage in the second head of cover under the Aspen wording. As noted before, the Las Vegas shooting in 2017 ultimately ended up with the casino being liable for $800 million US. That's due to the courts considering them being liable and failing to secure the premises and ultimately leading to the shooting happening. So $800 million US, almost $1 billion from one shooting incident in the United States. Of course, the US is a somewhat litigious country compared to many countries in the Asia Pacific region, but these legal liability settlements can be extraordinarily high across Asia Pacific as well as North America. Next, we obviously provide physical damage, property damage cover as a result of the active assailant incident. So in terms of an active assailant incident, if there was an improvised explosive device set off on the premises, that could cause significant property damage. Equally, as noted in the KORAT shopping mall attack example, there may be very limited property damage. It could be smashed glass or bullet holes, minor damage, but still physical damage to a company's or a business's property. So physical damage is a standard cover under the active assailant policy. Touching back on what we mentioned before about active assailant being the future of terrorism insurance, traditional conventional terror attacks are still covered, and so the widespread property damage that these conventional attacks often cause would still be covered under an active assailant policy. The business interruption element of cover is a crucial element of cover and one that most clients desperately need and desperately want. So if there was a shooting at a shopping mall in KORAT, as we said, the shopping mall itself will be closed for 4 or 5 days, but also so that's lost revenue. But also the businesses in the wider area suffer financial loss because of a denial of access, an ingress-egress issue as a result of the incident. That's also something that is covered under a standard active assailant policy. When it comes to the threat of an incident, if you're a casino or a hotel and rely on footfall, or a restaurant and rely on footfall to create revenue for yourself, a validated threat from a, say, bomb, or a threat of a bomb where police has validated that you need to evacuate your premises, a 2 or 3 hour evacuation sweep of your premises and then back to business as usual, that can have a significant financial impact on your operations. And so threats of active assailant incidents would also be covered. As we noted in the KORAT attack and in many other examples, even when a business is able to get back up and running after an attack, there's often a downturn in revenue from lost attraction or continuing loss from people not being willing or being less willing to stay or go to your premises. If I owned a hotel or somebody owned a hotel and there was an attack at that hotel, there's likely to be a downturn in bookings to that hotel even after the incident has been responded to, the incident is over, the business is back up and running, but there's likely to be a downturn in bookings. And so that financial impact is something that an active assailant policy would respond to. As I mentioned before, it's not only a direct financial and revenue impact, which is the outcome of a sort of active assailant incident. It's also a whole host of extra costs. As I mentioned before, extra expenses like emergency security arrangements, medical expenses, forensic cleanup and funeral expenses, and brand rehabilitation costs. These are all soft costs, additional expenses that an assured is likely to suffer and have to pay for as a result of an active assailant incident. So these soft costs and these extra expenses are also covered under an active assailant incident. This is something that helps the client get back up on their feet and gets them back up and running as swiftly as possible, and is sought after by a number of clients and policyholders. So finally, the last main head of cover is the response company fees, and I'm going to touch on the response element of an active assailant policy in just a moment. But essentially, a response company fee is the fees incurred by a dedicated response company who will respond to an incident. Now, before we go on to the response element, we have another poll for you. And a question I'd like to ask you is, what do you think the average time, the average duration of an active assailant incident will last for? Do you think it's A, 12 hours, B, 12 minutes, C, 1 hour, or D, 1 day? Again, I believe everybody has about 20 seconds left to answer the poll here. And whilst people are thinking and considering their answers, I should say that, as I mentioned possibly before, we utilize Lloyd's and the Lloyd's platform to offer the Active Assailant product. This is very much a Lloyd's driven and Lloyd's supported initiative. Okay. So, many of you have answered, many of you were unsure, but the spread of answers is reasonably even. I can reveal to you the answer is in fact B, 12 minutes. 12 minutes and 12 minutes only is the average duration of an active assailant incident. So from the time an assailant launches their attack to the time it's completely resolved, 12 minutes only. Now, why is that important? We're now going to touch on the response side of an active assailant policy and the importance of having a good and rapid response. From an ASSALANT perspective, we utilize a response company called NYA, who are part of GardaWorld, GardaWorld being the largest private security company in the world. And we utilize dedicated responders who are ex-CIA, FBI, hostage negotiators with a global footprint and a presence here in Asia Pacific. Now, why is that important? This is NYA's global footprint, and as you can see, we have a key response hub here in Singapore for the Asia Pacific region. The importance of a good response company cannot be underestimated. Now, in the event of an incident, a client will take a phone call. The first phone call will be to the police. The second phone call is likely to be to NYA GardaWorld. And these responders who have dealt with these incidents in the past and have responded to these incidents will guide them through what to do, who to liaise with, and what to say and when to say. They will also fly a responder to the scene of the incident immediately. So by having a response hub in Singapore, for the Asia Pacific region, rather than flying from London or North America, we have people on the ground here already who can get to an incident a lot quicker than otherwise they may be able to. The responders have a 24-hour line with a whole host of languages spoken, so there's no issues in terms of linguistic challenges. But what happens in the event of an incident? Well, you can see here a timeline of what happens during an active assailant attack. And you'll see there the 12-minute average incident time and the law enforcement activity that will happen. So it's likely that an assailant will be killed or certainly arrested or killed in the event of an incident. After the 12 minutes, after the incident is over, the client will call NYA GardaWorld, the responders, and as I say, NYA will guide them through the process in terms of the communications, in terms of the organization, and in terms of understanding who to speak to, what to say, and how to respond in as best a way as possible. Now, being able to respond as well as you can is crucial, not only in terms of saving lives, but also in terms of helping businesses limit the damage done by these attacks. It's not just the response, however, that responding to it after an incident, which is important. It's also all the work that can be done before an incident happens. So you'll see here on the left of the incident happening a whole host of prevention services that are provided by the security consultants, the crisis responders. This ranges from online trainings for a policyholder, e-learning modules, to a dedicated responder flying to a premises, reviewing the security arrangements, creating active assailant protocols for those that don't have them, and for those that do have them, improving those protocols. This prevention training, similar to a risk management allowance, is provided to all policyholders under an ASSALANT active assailant policy. And it's crucial because not only does it, as I say there on the slide, reduce the likelihood of an incident happening, but it also increases preparedness and understanding of what to do in the event of an incident, reducing the damage of an incident happening and trying to limit the likelihood of it happening in the first place. By having seasoned, experienced responders who know what they're doing and have dealt with this situation before, they can prepare a client to deal with this active assailant risk. As we said before in the presentation, this is a risk which is very unpredictable, but based upon the examples I've shown you today, it's not unforeseeable. And so being as prepared as possible is crucial. Now, in terms of the capacity available, for the Lloyd's Asia market, there's approximately US 500 million of active assailant capacity available. So a very meaningful, substantial amount of active assailant capacity is available for clients in the region. For market-leading players such as Aspen, US 50 million is the standard market size that could be line size that could be provided to individual risks. So there is meaningful capacity in Asia Pacific, and it is being used, and there is demand. So this is a growing threat, and the capacity there is likely to grow in line with demand from policyholders in the region and clients in the region. So from an insurance solution perspective, there is a comprehensive insurance coverage solution, there is a dedicated response solution, and there is meaningful capacity to actually add value to clients in terms of their insurance purchasing. Now, having spoken for the last sort of 35 or so minutes, just to touch back on what we said at the beginning of the presentation, what I was hoping everybody will be able to take away from the webinar in terms of, okay, well, what is an active assailant incident? How does it affect me and my clients? And what are the insurance solutions? And hopefully I've been able to address those. But really the key message is that whilst we've seen incidents, active assailant attacks in other parts of the world over the last few years, the frequency and severity of incidents in this part of the world is growing, unfortunately. Incidents not only affect specific sites targeted, but they have a much wider impact and it's those businesses which may not have an active assailant policy who will be most affected. And just to summarize in terms of what we consider active assailant, we're really talking the majority of violent incidents here, including conventional, traditional terrorist attacks. But by removing the requirement for a motive, we really do see this as the future of the terrorism insurance market. Hopefully that's provided everybody with an overview of how we see active assailants, how it is a growing threat for the Asia Pacific region, and how Lloyd's and the insurance market is doing lots to provide solutions to clients to address this evolving threat. I think that's everything I had in terms of the presentation. I know we have some time for Q&A now, so thank you all very much for your time, and I look forward to any and all questions you may have.
Thanks, Dominic, for sharing the very useful information. I guess we can only accept that such unfortunate events are increasing in frequency in the world, and our region is also included. I think personally, in the last few slides, the incident training exercises and included, it's really value added to the traditional insurance policy, and hopefully this will increase the preparedness for these unpredictable events. Dominic, I've got a few questions from the audiences.
Great.
Yeah, definitely. So the first one goes like this. What kind of businesses purchase the product, the active assailant product?
That's a great question. Thanks very much for asking that. In terms of businesses and who buys the product, it's really any business where there are people. I mean, if you think of an active assailant incident, you may think of soft targets like shopping malls, restaurants, hotels, where there's widespread common footfall, a lot of people in public places, and it's easy to instigate an attack. So there's that sort of occupancy type and industry type, but there's also a growing trend of workplace violence incidents. There was a hostage situation in the Philippines in a shopping mall only a matter of months ago, where a disgruntled employee, security guard, went back to the premises, shot somebody and held hostages. We see workplace violence as a growing trend, so it's also offices in a whole range of different industry types. So a wide base of businesses and companies and people who are looking to purchase the product.
Sure, thank you. I think this is a second part of the same question as well. I think what the person asking is interested to know the level of deductibles these policies normally come with.
Great, yeah, that's another good question. Thanks very much. In terms of the active assailant policy, and the product from an ASPA perspective at least, we see this very much as a crisis response product, and because of that, all active assailant policies that we offer are offered with nil deductible as standard. So there is no requirement for a deductible on the policy. The reason being is that for an active assailant incident, we don't want the client to be worried about how much an incident has impacted them before they can make a claim. We can, of course, offer deductibles on policies, but our default position is nil deductible as standard.
Thank you. The next question is, it looks like it's based on coverage of the active assailant policy. So how does the active assailant policy work if my client already buys terrorism insurance? I think I'll combine another question with this since it does look quite similar. Does the active assailant insurance policy form a subset of the terrorism policy, or is it the other way around?
Yeah, two great questions. So thank you again for these. In terms of how an standalone active assailant policy would interact and sit in line with a conventional terrorism insurance policy, well, the important thing to flag when it comes to active assailant policies, and ASPANs in particular, is that active assailant, if there are two policies which provide the same cover, active assailant sits primary to any other insurance. So if there was a conventional terror attack and an active assailant policy was in place and a terrorism insurance policy was in place, the active assailant policy would respond first. And so in terms of answering the second part of your question, is it a subset of terrorism? We actually see a lot of our clients purchasing a primary active assailant layer and then just a limited terrorism layer on top of the active assailant coverage. And the benefit for that is that, firstly, there's nil deductible on a primary layer. Second of all, they have much wider coverage on the primary layer, but yet they're able to top up on top of that to provide them with the capacity required from a conventional terror attack. So firstly, if there are two policies, the active assailant policy would respond first. And secondly, we see a lot of clients replacing their conventional terror policies with active assailant insurance. From the liability perspective, to touch on that, if there is a GL policy and there's an incident, active assailant incident for a client with a GL policy, since the Las Vegas shooting, we see a number of GL carriers now excluding active assailant liability. But if there is any grey area, if it's unclear, the active assailant policy, again, sits primary to that other coverage. So it really provides clients affirmative coverage, gives them peace of mind, and leaves no grey area. Hopefully that's answered that.
That's very clear. Thanks, Dominic. There is one on underwriting. So the attendee is interested to know how the active assailant cover is underwritten differently from a more traditional terrorism cover. I mean, you're the expert on that, so I shouldn't jump in.
No, thank you. It's a very good question, one we're asked a lot. In terms of the underwriting process itself and how it's different from terrorism underwriting, it's not too dissimilar. I think we see, there are traditional terrorism models, very hard to predict an active assailant incident. So in terms of the underwriting process, we really do factor in a handful of important points. What are we insuring? Where is it? What is the exposure in terms of BI revenue? And have they had any history of active assailant incidents before? Basically, having those 4 or 5 key bits of information, we're able to utilize the software we have, be able to tap in, for example, the infographics, the images earlier of the specific cities, and hone in and understand, okay, what's the risk profile of this area, and then factor that into our underwriting. So we don't require too much information when it comes to the underwriting process, so it's a very easy process for clients to get quotes.
That's good to hear. Thanks, Dominic. There is one interesting question. Well, active assailant implies that passive assailant also exists, but not covered. Could you please confirm that there's such a term, passive assailant?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we describe the market as an active assailant market because an assailant would have to actively attack somebody. So I'm not 100% sure what the person who asked the question means by passive assailant, but given the very broad trigger points and very broad definitions within an active assailant policy, the vast majority of violent incidents would be covered. So if there's an accidental slip and somebody's injured, that's not an active assailant incident. But if there is an attack, then more than likely it would be.
Sure, thanks. Hopefully, passive assailant also means that there will be no attacks, right? So, guess no coverage probably needed for that. Right. There is a question on the determination of what is considered terrorism. So, who decides what action is considered terrorism? Does the authority have a say, or does the insurer have a say in that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, if for many countries around the world, they may have, for example, government pools where they have a specific section within the government that has to validate something as an act of terrorism for that to trigger the state pool. But in terms of terrorism insurance policies, it's what is provable in a court of law, depending on the law and jurisdiction of that policy. So, as I said earlier, the criteria is proof of a motive, which would have to be politically, religiously, or ideologically driven. So that's really the definition of what a traditional act of terrorism is.
Thanks, Dominic. And I suppose, like what you've shared earlier, the active assailant cover is wider than that, and you probably don't have to prove, that there's any of those factors involved.
Absolutely, and the whole point of the active assailant policy is it removes that grey area. Can you prove the motive of somebody who's likely to have been killed during the incident? A policyholder of an active assailant policy doesn't have to worry about proving that motive. A policyholder of a traditional terrorism insurance policy, they would have to prove that.
I think this is a bit of an extension on the previous question. Does the active assailant policy cover attacks by mentally unstable people?
Yes, absolutely. We see a growing trend and a recurring theme of mentally unstable individuals, as we saw in Melbourne, and one of the examples I provided on that slide. That was a mentally unstable individual, no premeditation, just essentially a crazy person. And really, we do see active assailant as more than anything. Yes, it covers conventional terror attacks, but it covers the unpredictable. And mentally unstable people are unpredictable. And so the short answer to that is yes, that is absolutely covered.
Sure, thank you. This question, I think it goes back to one of your quiz questions, the one on the amount of time that an active assailant attack is on average it's 12 minutes, right? I remember that particular quiz question. Does this time frame have an impact on the coverage under the AA policy? For example, what about hostage situations, which traditionally I would imagine the time taken to be a bit longer to resolve the incident?
The answer to that is no. The period of time that the incident takes has no impact on whether the active assailant policy would respond. Whether that, it could be a stabbing in a shop and then the assailant flees, the police investigate and shut the road down. That's, again, still something that would be covered. Equally, if we look at hostage situation, as we saw in the Philippines and as we saw in Thailand, in KORAT, those tend to last longer. And all that means is that the impact of those is more than likely typically higher. But that doesn't impact whether the policy would respond. So the period of time that it lasts for has no impact in terms of whether the policy would be in place and respond.
Right. Thank you. Thanks, Dom. The next few questions actually revolve around the loss prevention training that's provided as part of the policy. So the question is this training free? And I guess personally, I add if this is compulsory.
Yes, it's a good question. It is free with every policy holder. So every policy, you get your free prevention training. Is it compulsory? No, you certainly don't have to take up the training, but we would strongly encourage our policyholders to do so. From an insurer's perspective, it improves, the risk of that individual policy. But more importantly, for the policyholder's perspective, it's free. It reduces the likelihood of an incident happening, and it trains people and provides information on what to do if an event does happen. So in that respect, we think, everybody's a winner from the free prevention training. It's free, and we encourage people to do so, but there is no, it's not compulsory.
Sure, definitely, I understand. I guess if I had that policy, definitely would go on the training as well, personally. Again, on the training, on the value-added services that are provided. Well, for example, if an insured had gone through this, incident response, would you think that that there would be some reduction of rates provided, since this is, it will become a better risk in terms of terrorism or active assailant policy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, the way we underwrite this is by allocating a portion of the premium to the response side of things. So if a client does take up the active assailant response, the prevention training, then yes, in our eyes, the risk would improve. And when we come around to look at that risk again at renewal, we can then have a conversation with the client based upon them being more prepared and understanding the risk of active assailant incidents a lot better.
Sure, thank you. I think this is a common question in most of our webinars. I think a lot of the audiences are interested to understand more of the claims ratio for this particular product, and they are curious also to know which are the countries in which the most frequent or severe claims occur for this particular active assailant product. Great.
Thank you for the question. In terms of claims, obviously we can't give specific information about any claims that may or may not happen, but in terms of incidents that occur across the region, provided a list of a whole host of incidents, and really the message I would send to people is, whilst there are recurring themes in specific territories, for example, attacks in CBD Melbourne or Sydney in Australia, in other places in Manila and Hong Kong and Bangkok, these are just a list of cities to flag. But the point to flag is here that it's a very unpredictable risk, and although the likelihood of an incident happening in larger cities is higher because there are more people there, and because the impact of an active assailant attack is likely to be higher because of the number of people and number of businesses. Although the incidents tend to be in larger cities, they also happen in smaller towns, in rural areas, and so the impact is, and the incidents are, almost anywhere you can have people and businesses. So it's across the region, and the examples I provided in the presentation sort of highlight that. It's across most industries, and it's across most territories.
Thanks, Dominic. There is a question which, I think this is an interesting one. It relates to recent events that are happening globally. So the question is, this attendee is asking if the COVID-19 related threats are covered. So, for example, if a person who is a COVID-19 carrier visits the insured shopping centers and threatens to spread the diseases if they're not paid any money.
Oh,
I think this is I think this is an interesting one. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question, very topical. So thank you to whoever raised that. In terms of communicable disease, spreading of diseases, that's not something that would typically be covered under an active assailant policy. But what would be covered is any bodily injury that would occur as a result of that individual going to the premises. So, for example, if they went into a bank and said, give me the money, or I'm going to spread COVID-19, a scuffle ensued, a weapon was used, then that's something that would be covered. But yeah, typically not something that is, in terms of COVID-19, that's covered under an active assailant policy. But any attack or incident that turns violent as a result of the initial incident, that would be covered.
Sure. Thanks, Dominic. A little bit of a more, coming back to Singapore, a little bit more local context. Would you consider Singapore a safe country in terms of terrorism or crisis management underwriter? And I suppose, they're curious to know if you see, increasing trend in Singapore insureds taking up this particular coverage for active assailants.
It's a great question, and thanks again for that one. In terms of Singapore, I mean, if you were to look at the number of violent incidents that happen in Singapore compared to other major cities in the region, yes, I mean, it's pretty universally accepted that there are less of those incidents that do occur in Singapore. That being said, and going back to one of the previous questions, active assailant insurance responds to attacks from not only premeditated attacks and planning from an assailant, but also from mentally unstable people. And so, because of that, Singapore Singapore has mentally unstable people as the whole world does, and it's very difficult to predict what somebody like that may do. So, on that basis, whilst we see the threat of a pre-planned, sophisticated terror attack as slightly lower in Singapore as other territories, we do still see demand for the product based upon the unpredictable. And yes, we do see a lot of demand for the product in Singapore. We've gained good traction here, and there's an acknowledgement of the value of this insurance, which provides, as I mentioned before, obviously conventional terror attack cover as well. So it's the next sort of generation evolution of a product which has been in terrorism insurance, which has been sort of taken up by Singapore itself, sort of quite widespread. And so, yes, because of that, we do see demand for the product in Singapore.
Thanks, Dominic. I think we have time for one final question. There is this question on how are riots or civil unrest situations or incidents, are these considered active assailants? Would these be covered under the policy?
It's a great question, and again, one we are asked on a regular basis from people that we speak to about active assailant insurance. So in terms of traditional strike, riot, civil commotion, political unrest, that's not something which sits within a conventional active assailant policy. However, any violent incidents that arise because of those protests or riots, so for example, there's protests in the street and a counter-protest comes and there's a vehicle attack, as we see in many countries, that would be considered an active assailant incident, but the original protests themselves wouldn't be. So in the next generation of active assailant, that may expand, but as it is at the moment, that's the coverage available to those seeking to buy.
Sure. Thank you, Dominic, for answering the many questions that we have had today. I think, unfortunately, we're not able to answer more. There are more questions actually from the audience, but due to time constraint, I see that we have reached the allocated time for the webinar. So we will reach out to the rest of the attendees who have asked the questions, and we will try to answer them all. So we have come to the end of today's webinar session. So feel free to reach out to either Dominic or myself after this presentation if you have further inquiries on today's presentation, or other specialist crisis management insurance solutions that Lloyd's Asia can offer. So as mentioned earlier, today's session is recorded and that the recordings will be made available at the end of the month. I'd like to remind everyone on the call to sign up for the September webinar sessions of the Lloyd's Asia Broker Program, and there will be 8 sessions being held in September. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for our webinar today. Thank you and have a good day ahead.